Hello and welcome to The Political Orphanage, a home for plucky misfits and friendly crime fighters. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton. Hey, you know crime? That thing? I'm not a fan. Which is a problem because it seems to have caught a second wind over the last few years, at least anecdotally. In terms of just people I know, I keep hearing about the country becoming less safe, more violent, and increases in things like shoplifting and burglaries. But that's anecdotal. I don't actually know, is crime on the rise, or are we just talking about it more? Which is exactly why I am bringing on a criminologist today, a criminologist and an economist, to walk us through trends in crime, not just since the pandemic, but since the 90s. How do we stack up now compared to 2020, and how does 2020 stack up compared to 1990? But wait, it gets even better. We're not just going to learn about present crime rates. We're also going to dive into the causes and deterrents of crime. What makes crime increase in a country, and what policies are effective at suppressing it? And best, because my guest is, by training, an economist, we are going to ask her, what are we presently wasting money on in terms of stopping crime? What is not a good use of taxpayer money, and what would be a cheaper use of taxpayer money instead? What would be good bang for our buck in terms of keeping us safe? That's right. I alone have dared to take the topics of murder, assault, and gang warfare and asked, can I make this more interesting by applying math? I think I can. You be the judge. Enjoy. I am joined today by Jennifer Doleac. She is the Executive Vice President of Criminal Justice at Arnold Ventures, which is a juggernaut of criminal justice reform in the United States, one of the largest organizations working on that regularly. Jen and I became friends a couple of years ago, and then she promptly broke my heart by moving to Houston, Texas, to take on her role there after a prominent stint in academia. Hello, Jen.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited to talk to you, partly because I wanted to hang out with you, but also because I feel like you can speak Heaton better than a lot of other people, because your background, even though you work in criminal justice and you work in criminal justice reform, your background is economics. And while I am not an economist, I feel like I can slip into economist cocktail parties. And so this is a good way to reach me in terms of what works and doesn't work. So I'll kick it off. I don't even know what the camps are in the criminal justice world or the criminologist world. Can you give me kind of a bright line of, are there two opposing schools of thought? Do all of you agree with each other and politicians just refuse to listen to you? What does that world look like?
Oh gosh, I feel like I'm still learning about all the different camps. Yeah, so I'm definitely coming from the economics camp, to the extent that it is a separate camp, which is based heavily on the theory that people are mostly rational actors, or at least they respond to incentives the way that people do in all other areas of life. There are definitely lots of other criminal justice researchers who don't focus as much on answering causal questions and testing what works, more theorists, and I am not even going to try to go through all of the different criminology theories on this podcast, because I would get half of them wrong. Okay. But there are a lot of different ideas out there, mostly in the criminology space. And I think where economists come in, we're mostly like, great, there are lots of theories. Let's actually go test and see what works. And so that is my perspective on this. And yes, of course, the politicians don't listen to us nearly as much as they should.
Okay. Well, like I know, like with economics, people respond to incentives. Pretty much all economists agree on that. And I think that we could say that there's a general consensus among economics or economists that price controls don't tend to work very well, that some things work better than others. I'm curious as to, in criminology, are there broad consensi that the field has arrived on that are otherwise ignored by the electorate?
Yeah, I would say there are two big things that we know at this point from really strong empirical research. So one is that putting more police on the streets reduces crime.
Okay.
So policing has a strong deterrent effect on especially violent crime. The second is that long prison sentences have very little deterrent effect on crime. So locking someone up takes them off the street. So that can have what we call an incapacitation effect, which is helpful if the person is an active public safety risk. But the threat of a really long prison sentence doesn't deter crime as much as we might hope, because most people who are on the margin of committing crime simply are not thinking that far ahead. So short-run consequences matter a lot. The probability of getting caught matters a lot. That's why police are so effective. Prisons are not effective.
I spoke to somebody last year from the Rand Corporation that had a similar analysis of people involved in alcohol or substance-related crimes. That what they found was increasing the punishment for drunk driving, doing meth, whatever the thing was. That did not seem to have a big effect. But when they were randomly called to the courthouse or daily called to the courthouse or whatever the facility was and tested, that having immediacy was much more effective than long-scale punishment. And so that seems to be true in all the criminology world.
I'm not sure that I would definitely not say that all criminologists agree with this, but that I know the program that you're talking about. It's either 24/7 sobriety or sobriety 24/7. I can never remember the order. But yeah, it's this idea that we're going to give you really short, quick consequences if you break the rules related to drinking or doing drugs. And that has a really big deterrent effect on that behavior, which a lot of people really don't like, because they like thinking of addiction and substance use disorders as being a health problem and not one that can ever be addressed using incentives. So I think what this research shows is, for a lot of people, you can address it by changing the incentives. And for those whose behavior you don't change, obviously you need something else. But incentives can go a long way.
Does the criminologist world of researchers line up with the divisions within the political world? So like if I were being really cartoonish with criminal justice reform, I would have Norway on one end and I would have Joe Arpaio on the other end. So Norway, their position is, when you're arrested, we will treat you to therapy and vocational training. And I very much err towards that myself. And Joe Arpaio is, we'll throw a brick at them, that'll learn them, treat them as horrible as they can, and they won't come back, right? And that would be the cartoon between Republicans and Democrats, I suppose. Is that reflected in the criminologist world, or do you guys have more than two camps? Like, how does it compare?
Yeah. So one of the things I love most about working in this area is that there really isn't a left and right in this policy space the way that there is on most issues. So you wind up with a lot of strange bedfellows, right? So you wind up on criminal justice reform over the past decade or so. You often have the Koch brothers at the same table as really progressive reformers. And the way I tend to think of it is, the libertarians are at the table because this is a big failed government program, right? And they want smaller government. The religious right is at the table because they believe in redemption and second chances. And the left is at the table because they are worried about racial disparities and general social injustice. And so they're all there for different reasons. People of very different political persuasions who would not agree on anything else, but they're all at the same table for the same reasons with the same goals. And that means we get a lot more done in this space, especially at the state level, than I think happens in other spaces.
This is the most hopeful governmental reform statement anyone on this program has made in the last 3 years. This is great. So, like, broadly speaking, it's the camps that are involved here in terms of advocacy are coming at it from different perspectives and different sources of impetus, but they're not juxtaposed to one another in terms of their worldview or their solutions. We both agree that treating people in this prison horribly is not a good idea. I am doing it because I have a Norwegian humanitarian impulse. My progressive friend sees that there are more black people there than white people, so they're bothered by the racial disparity. But even though we're seeing different things, we can both agree that there's a problem and move forward.
Often, yeah. I mean, there are certainly exceptions. There is still a real tough on crime faction that likes the throw a brick at them example that you gave earlier. But I think in general, there's a lot more common ground here than in most places. I'll give you one example that our team at AV has been working on recently is thinking about a prison conditions crisis. And so our advocacy team and policy team have been working together to bring folks who represent corrections officers together with people who represent people who are incarcerated and their families. And all of them are very concerned about safety levels in prisons right now. Prisons are really unsafe. That is bad for the people who work there. It is bad for the people who live there. And so everyone agrees that this is a crisis and we need to do something about it. And those are groups that very rarely are on the same side of criminal justice issues.
You mentioned a moment ago that immediacy has a deterrent effect. So having more cops on the streets that are able to arrest people promptly or identify things that are going awry, that has a deterrent effect. That longer prison sentences do not seem to have a deterrent effect or have marginal utility in terms of doing so. In terms of just the severity of the prison sentences, not the length, but the severity, does that have any deterrent effect? If we put people in Norwegian-style pillow fight vocational training versus putting them in cattle pens, do people go, I don't want to live in a cattle pen, and that actually has an effect?
So there's been some research on this the challenge in studying this is you need something like a natural experiment where people are randomly assigned to places with better prison conditions versus worse. And so in the US at least, or in most places, the range of conditions is not going to be large enough that you get a really big disparity like the one you're describing. But at least in, slightly better versus slightly worse conditions, more overcrowded versus less, there seems to be, I think there's a little bit of evidence that maybe it has a slight deterrent effect in the same way that longer prison sentences maybe have a little bit of a deterrent effect, but it's swamped by the evidence on increasing the probability that you get caught and the probability of consequences. And so I'd put it in the same bucket at this point.
Okay. All right. So making people eat green hot dogs and cracking rocks in the yard all day is probably not the way to do it.
Not if you want to improve public safety. I think another big thing that gets lost in a lot of these conversations is there are a few different reasons we punish people, right? So the reason I am focused on, and the reason that, or the types of arguments that someone like me can be helpful in developing, are around what works to improve public safety. So what works, what is effective at changing behavior in the way that we want? And that's an empirical question that we can use data to answer. Another reason that we punish people is purely retribution, right? Someone did something bad and they deserve bad things to happen to them. And even if it turns out that makes all of us less safe, maybe we still do it because we think it's the right thing to do. And so that is sort of another piece of our criminal justice policy conversation in the US that hangs over all of this, I think. And I think a lot of us have at least a little bit of retributive justice in our heads. And the question is just how much we're willing to let that go for the conversation about what actually makes us safer.
Okay, this is really, really helpful. So if we were breaking down criminal justice into two different spectrums or two different phenomenon, one is safety and the other is retribution. Who are we worried about versus who are we angry with? And these are not necessarily the same thing. I think in my case, I'm like 80-20 safety versus retribution, or maybe 90-10 safety versus retribution. When I am not directly affected. When I am directly affected, I think it immediately switches to like 50-50, something like that. But generally, I would highly, highly prioritize safety and prevention over retribution.
Yeah, same. I think this is the economist. This is what makes you an economist at your core, I think.
Yeah, deep down. Yeah, deep down, I'm one of you all. Well, okay. On the tough on crime one, noting like my priors are, I would fire Joe Arpaio and I would replace him with a Norwegian criminal specialist that's going to teach everybody how to become software engineers or something. Like I'm very much coming from that camp. But in the last couple of years, I hear lots of rhetoric that my inclination has led to an increase in crime, most specifically in San Francisco. And I realize that it's very, very, very complex, but when we get into like, if I were in charge of drugs, I would treat it like a medical problem rather than a criminal problem. And then in San Francisco, there seem to be all these, open streets full of people doing heroin. So, what is going on here? Is there an element of tough on crime? Has it declined and that's led to an increase in crime, or is it just rhetorical spin?
Oh, I think it's mostly rhetorical spin at this point. So there's a lot that's been happening over the last few years, and it's really difficult to figure out what's a causal link and what's just correlation here, right? So during COVID, violent crime rates went up across the country. So similar to the drug conversation, which I'll come back to in a moment, a lot of people point to progressive prosecutor policies, for instance, as a driver of violent crime, or bail reform as being a driver of violent crime. But violent crime went up everywhere, not just in places that had those policies. And so research that tries to distinguish what was the effect of those policies on crime shows basically no link, no change in crime rates. Which maybe isn't great for the progressive prosecutor's side, right? They like to think that crime fell, but it certainly isn't driving an increase in violent crime that we saw.
When you say progressive prosecutor, you mean like the warm-hearted DA that says we're not going to prosecute people for shoplifting eggs or something like that? Like we're
going to err toward leniency,
okay.
Right? And some are more have more definitive policies than others, like you were just describing, where it's like we're not going to prosecute people for shoplifting anymore, versus we're just going to be erring toward leniency more. But yeah, I mean, every prosecutor is different, obviously. But there are a lot of prosecutors out there that are interested in whether a more this single-minded focus on just convict as many people and punish as many people as you can. Maybe that's not the best use of their resources, and maybe they should be using those powers more selectively. Which is a good question to ask. I think on the drug issue in San Francisco is, I think an outlier in many ways. I think there's a lot of stuff going on in San Francisco that we don't fully understand. Surely it's a combination of an actual change in policies and a perception of change in policies that is changing behavior. I believe enough in the power of incentives to think that there probably was a real reduction in consequences for folks, and that is what they were responding to. But I think there's still a lot that we're figuring out about what on earth is going on in San Francisco.
Okay, but with the selective prosecutorial I'm sorry, what was the phrase here? The nice
progressive prosecutors.
What was it?
Progressive prosecutors.
Okay, so the sweater vest prosecutors versus the cowboy hat prosecutors. That does not seem to be causal in terms of increases in crime, which is to say that presumably blue cities that have prosecutors erring on the side of leniency, they saw an increase in crime, but so did rock-ribbed, hard-lined, square-jawed, lock-em-all-up cities as well. So that would not appear to be the problem. Was it economic in nature? And by that, my not knowing anything about this, my first impulse would be, well, the crime was a result of declining opportunity as a result of lockdowns and things like that. So you would see an increase in cities that had hard lockdowns like New York City and LA, but you wouldn't see an increase in places like Houston or Miami. How did it shake out?
Yeah, so it's sort of interesting here is that the crimes that went up were almost exclusively homicide and shootings, and almost everything else went down.
Wow, so immediately my theory goes out the gate. That's very helpful. Thank you. We're closer to the truth.
Yeah,
it wasn't just egg shoplifting went up as economic opportunity declined. It was shootings, beheadings, things like that. Okay.
Right. Which I mean could result from heated fights over eggs, I suppose, but relatively rare. So I mean, during this period when homicide and shootings were going up initially, there were lots of theories floating around. It was a very fun time to be a crime expert, and I would say, surely all of us, if we haven't already been proven wrong, will be proven wrong eventually about exactly what was driving this. My initial thought was that this is just about having fewer eyes on the streets. Everybody is home, right? And so the people that are willing to go out and break rules can do so with impunity, and nobody's around to be a witness or a bystander, and so you wind up with more shootings. But then when the lockdowns lightened up and we all started moving around again, you didn't see those violent crime rates come down. at the same time. They're now coming down, but there was a huge lag. And so it seems that the best theory I've heard, the one that's kind of stuck around the longest, is that it was the result of both like an increase in gun purchases. So a lot of people bought more guns at the beginning of the pandemic. And then just a bit of a spiral. Like, there's probably a little bit of the eyes on the street story. And then once once people started going after each other, there's retaliation, and so that just kind of leads to this spiral or cycle of violence that took a while to die back down.
Okay, so picking apart the first one, the theory you started with, this is sort of a Jane Jacobs position that the more active a city's street life is, there's an automatic deterrent effect by it, which makes it, when I moved to New York a few years ago, which at least at the time was actually very safe, but given that I was raised in the 80s, I thought of it as burning trash cans and fingerless gloves.
Right.
And I immediately felt safe. If I was going down a street I didn't know and I could see an old lady with groceries, I'm like, I'm fine. But there was that kind of like, okay, there's enough neighbors out here, that sort of thing. And so everybody's on lockdown. They go in, or maybe not lockdown, but they're being more cautious. With the gun thing, I did an episode with Guy Smith a couple of years ago where I went over gun statistics. And as I recall, the amount of guns in the population has increased considerably since the 1960s, but crime rates have gone down. So I would say that they're orthogonal to one another, or the amount of guns is not causal to increased crime, but it would seem that you've got data that would indicate otherwise.
Yeah, I think most other studies. So it sounds like, that broad correlation over many decades is challenging to draw a causal link from, right? There's just lots of other stuff that happens during that time. And so most studies I've seen that are looking at more specific policies or at spikes in gun purchases, for instance, show an increase in either violent crime or especially, gun injuries, which is not what we're talking about now. But yeah, I think there does tend to be more of a causal link between these two things. And the question is just, how easy is it to break that causal link?
So then in the case of the pandemic, if people are scared or there's an increase in some kind of crime, people respond by preemptively buying guns, and then that creates a feedback loop, or that at least increases the capacity for things to go awry in terms of violence?
Yeah, I think the story that people have in mind is, a lot of those guns wind up getting stolen at some point. People keep them in their cars and they're not locked up or something like that. So it's not that the people go out and buy guns and then they go and shoot their neighbor. It's that the guns are just in circulation and available now, and eventually fall into the wrong hands. I should also clarify, these are like theories floating around about why crime went up during COVID and why it's kind of coming down now. And it's very fuzzy and difficult to really pin down, in the same way that we don't fully understand why crime went up in the early 90s and then started falling for decades, right? We still don't. We understand a lot about what causes crime now and how to reduce it, and we still have a very difficult time explaining those broad trends. So you should take everything I'm saying here with a grain of salt.
Great, thank you. Without we can dive into the theories behind it, but without getting into the theories, just looking at the outcome, can you give us a broad sweep of how bad crime has been over the last 30 years? Because like in the 80s, I feel like it was very high, at least based on when in Star Trek, The Voyage Home, they go back to San Francisco in 1986 and they're very worried about crime, which I assume they did their research on in terms of being able to make it completely emblematic of statistics at the time. But it was, as I understood, it was on the decline for many, many, many years. Did it in 2020? Did it skyrocket back to where it'd been in 1980? Was it still lower? Kind of give us an idea of just what would a chart look like in terms of crime in the United States from 1980 to now?
Yeah, so crime and especially violent crime went up in the 1980s, peaked in the early 90s, and then mysteriously started falling, and basically kept falling until 2020. And then it spiked again in 2020, not nearly as high as it had been in the early 90s.
Okay.
But much higher than anyone can remember in the past decade or two. And so it was really scary. And then it started falling again And again, when I say crime spiked in 2020, it was homicides and shootings. So the worst crime.
We're not talking
crime
about shoplifting. We're not talking about disputes with HOA fences or something like that. It's like violent crime. Okay.
Violent crime, which is of course very scary. And
it's my least favorite kind of crime.
It's everybody's least favorite kind of crime. And that started falling again last year. It looks like, based on the numbers that we have, homicide has fallen in most places dramatically over the past year. So getting back close to where we were in 2019, if not quite there. And I think so. That's the broad trend. I think the spike in 2020 was scary, not only because it was high, it raised homicide rates higher than most of us can remember in the recent past, but also because we didn't understand it, just as we didn't understand the rise in crime in the 80s to early 90s. And so it kind of put a lot of people in a space where they thought, like, maybe we didn't understand why crime has been falling all this time either. Maybe this is going to be the beginning of another really long, rise in crime. And so we need to figure out a way to nip this in the bud really quickly and fight back. And so luckily that doesn't seem to be happening, but I think there's a lot of just general freaking out because we don't understand the root causes here.
Fair, because I have a very optimistic Pollyanna outlook on the world. And so I look at economics and I'm like, everybody, congratulations. We've cured 2/3 of poverty in the world in the last 50 years. We're kicking ass at this. And look, beheadings are down. Like when Marion Barry was mayor of DC, he had this great quote that DC, this is like in the late 80s, early 90s, DC has very low crime except for the murders. Like that was a quote from the mayor. And then I lived in DC and I was a lackadaisical Segway tour guide for a little bit, like puttering around on a Segway, and I was fine. So I was looking, going, oh, well, everything's just getting better. It's all working great. And then it stops, and that freaks people out. Where like Columbia Heights, where I used to live, used to be where all the hipsters were moving to start families. And then all of a sudden gangs started coming in, and it was very disturbing to that sense of everything's getting better. With the crime that occurred in 2020, was it uniform in terms of these violent increases across regions and cities or parts of cities? So is it that just everywhere violent crime got more, or was it in inner cities violent crime got more? Is it in rural counties and urban environments? How does it delineate across the landscape?
So based on the data we have, my understanding is it basically went up everywhere.
Okay.
I don't know exactly about like rural versus like suburban, urban, but anywhere that violent crime is a problem, where there could be murders, basically, violent crime went up. And so the best source on this is Jeff Asher. He runs this consulting firm called Datalytics, and he has a year-to-date murder dashboard. And that is the best data we have in the country on up to date.
It's called the murder dashboard?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Yeah, he'd be fun at a party. Okay, cool. And please continue.
Yeah. And so he was closely following all these murder trends for a while, and he was one of the ones who was making the point that this is going up everywhere.
Okay.
And now the decline is happening almost everywhere. I think it's Memphis and DC. It's not declining, and so things are very bad there, and people there are very worried. But everywhere else has been seeing big declines in crime since 2020.
I know that it's very difficult to make one-on-one comparisons with other countries for a variety of reasons. There are so many different elements at work. But
you're going to ask me anyway.
I'm going to ask you this anyway. Did we see these same trends occur in other countries, and did the decline happen at the same time? So like the United Kingdom, fewer guns. Did they have, I don't know, they're hitting each other in the faces with socks full of pennies or something? Did their violent crimes go up, and did they go down at the same rate, or did ours lag behind other countries?
That is a great question, and it reveals how focused I've been on U.S. policy recently. I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay. I appreciate your honesty. And
I'm not going to make something up.
But yeah, I appreciate it. Well, and also it is one of those things that is very difficult. Like I've been looking at unrelated political affectation quite a lot the last couple of years, and I've been working on a book on tribalism, and it's incredibly difficult for me to get data that I can actually compare between the United States and other countries, because all of the polling is different questions. So if in Sweden they ask, do you think politics is getting worse? But in America, we ask, do you like Democrats less? These are different questions, and you can't just say there's been an increase in them. So I would assume with criminology, there's very similar work going, or very similar confounding issues that would make it difficult to make those comparisons.
Yeah. Although, I mean, murder is murder, right? So like a lot of other...
Even Canadian murder.
even Canadian murder is very bad. Yeah. So I mean, often even across different states or different cities, there are different definitions of crimes. So folks who are really focused on aggregating data across counties and cities and states to put them all together spend a lot of time thinking about, is this robbery equivalent to this robbery, or is it this definition over here? And so it is remarkably complicated to say even, did robbery go up across all these states? But murder feels like should be a pretty consistent definition, even in other countries.
Within Backtrack, so it's now going down. It's lagged, even though the pandemic is concluded and lockdowns have concluded and the policies associated have gone. It persisted for a while. It's now going back down again. Why do we think that is? I assume the guns have not gone out of circulation. They don't spoil very quick.
That's true. Yeah. And this is where we don't have great theories yet. I'm sure there are some theories. I just haven't heard them. Because this sort of, you get a little tired of listening to people's theories after a while. When there's no actual evidence for them. Fortunately,
I have not been remotely inured to any of this. So let's backtrack back to the early 90s. So crime spikes in the late 80s, early 90s. It's worth pointing out it's still significantly higher than it was during 2020. It's not like we backtracked. We just kind of went up comparatively. So what are some? So theory one, Reagan
for why crime
fixed
declined in the 90s to
Reagan was bad or Clinton was good, something like that. Theory two, just the economy was getting better. It was heating up under Clinton, so it could be economic opportunity. Like what are the range of theories, broadly speaking, on why crime declined, and which one do you think has the best explanation?
Yeah, so my hunch is it's a whole bunch of stuff. There's not going to be one theory, but I'll give you kind of the range of theories that are out there. So we have the 1994 crime bill, which increased or focused on increasing incarceration, increasing police on the streets. Both of those, I think the best evidence shows maybe they contributed, but definitely based on what we know of the size of the effects of those things, there's no way they explain the whole decline. So there's stuff like that. We actually, crime was a problem, and so we tried to address the problem. That is one potential reason crime fell. Another hypothesis that's floating around that's very popular is the lead crime hypothesis, which is that lead was in gasoline for many years, and then about 15 or so years before the mid-90s, we took lead out of gasoline in the U.S. And so, and lead exposure when you're a small child is really terrible. And we have lots of evidence now, increases violent behavior later. And so it could be that by taking a lot of lead out of the environment or reducing lead exposure for young children in the 70s or early 80s, we dramatically reduced violent crime 15 to 20 years later. So that's one hypothesis that's floating around.
Okay.
Another much more controversial hypothesis is, but is sort of similar in spirit, I guess, is the legalization of abortion.
Okay.
And so that's another one that
that's in Freakonomics. They talk about
in Freakonomics,
that.
Right. He talked about that.
That's the idea that basically women and or families that do not have the economic resources or time bandwidth to raise a child well, that child is more apt to enter the criminal world. But by legalizing abortion, the people that were on the edges were no longer having kids, and so kids were largely relegated to people who wanted them, and therefore we just didn't have future criminals born.
Right. There's been some other research in somewhere in Europe, I'm forgetting where now, that showed a similar link to abortion legalization, but actually wound up connecting it more to the cohort size. So when abortion was legalized, you just have fewer children in general. And so each of those children got more resources, or like class sizes are smaller, and like things like that. And so so I was like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So it's just another way that this abortion story could affect crime rates 15, 20 years later, but in a slightly less controversial way.
Would that mean then that regardless, I guess we're going to, over a slow period of time, we in the United States will now have data available to us in terms of state by state whether abortion legality affects crime. But if it is cohort size rather than socioeconomic strata, then shouldn't crime just keep going down for a while? Because all of the developed nations have declining birth rates, so I would and increasing resources. So that would just mean if as long as people stay reasonably unhorny, as we have been, that we will have fewer and fewer children, and crime will go down between them.
Yeah, if we get rid of all the children,
yeah.
Then 15 to 20 years later, there'll be no crime.
Right. Great.
Yeah, no, I think this is honestly just a place where there's going to be a lot of stuff going on. And so predicting overall crime rates is really hard. Predicting changes in crime due to a specific policy is much easier. And so, so one could, I would not be surprised to see a study in a decade or so looking at what happened to different crime rates based on policy changes today. My hunch is that's not going to be a significant explainer of changes in crime rates.
Okay.
But I might be wrong.
What about economics? Do crime rates tend to rise in periods of depression or recession? Do they tend to decline in periods of increasing economic growth?
So I'm going to answer a slightly different question, which is basically how economic resources and local job markets and things like that affect crime and recidivism. We know a lot more about that, again, because answering these questions about more specific changes in policies or interventions in a place on specific people is much easier than explaining broad trends. And so we do know that, for instance, if you happen to be released from prison at a time when the local labor market is really strong, you are less likely to reoffend and wind up back in prison. So that suggests something like getting a job or having your friends and family have jobs is really good for reducing crime. We know that giving people money. So there's a really nice experiment looking at the effect of homelessness or emergency financial assistance. If you're at risk of losing your housing, that reduces crime. There's a bunch of stuff like this. Access to public benefits like food stamps and other kinds of welfare programs reduces recidivism. And so there are a lot of things like this that are very, I think is getting to the spirit of your question, which is that greater economic resources reduce both the economic pressure to commit crime. So if you're shoplifting, for instance, if that would be the crime, it's easy to see how giving someone some more resources would prevent that. But there's also a stress aspect to this, or when you're really financially stressed, you might drink more, for instance. And alcohol is very bad when we're talking about crime. You're much more likely to get into bar fights and do lots of stupid things that happen to be illegal.
Okay. And then is it for recidivism specifically, or is it just in general? And I ask that in that my initial, neoliberal impulses are just fix the economy and everything will be great. Crime rates will decline as well. But based on what you're saying, it sounds more like, no, that wouldn't affect the initial crime. It would rather affect the recidivism rate and the ability of criminals to re-enter the workforce. But I might be leaning too much into that statement.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think of specific studies off the top of my head where about like a change in economic resources and crime rates. My hunch, I think that is probably true. I'm just having I know of more studies looking at the recidivism piece. And because you're focused then on individual people rather than places, because there's so much going on in a place. But I think the general point holds that, fixing the economy does a lot of good things, including getting people into jobs, which keep people out of crime for a bunch of reasons. You're keeping them busy. You're surrounding them by good influences, other people who are at work all day. And you're giving them money that puts them in a better position and less reliant on crime.
Okay. Well, I want to shift now away from the kind of macro picture of what causes crime and what deters crime to specific policy implementations. You said at the beginning of our program very helpfully that we do know increasing the size of the police force has a deterrent effect as opposed to increasing the length of prison sentences. That's a wonderful gem that I will now steal and bring up in cocktail conversations. In terms of policies that we're doing right now, what is ineffective in terms of policing or rehabilitation that we're wasting our money on? What would you scrap based on the data?
Oh gosh. So my favorite in this space is based on research I've done, which is ban the box policies. So ban the box
Ooh.
is is a policy that is designed to help people with criminal records get their foot in the door with an employer. The problem we're trying to solve is that employers ask if you have a criminal record. It's a little box you check on a job application. If you check the box, they throw your application out. And so that seems really unfair, right? We want people with criminal records to have a second chance.
Yeah, you've done your time. We want you to be fully rehabilitated members of society. Welcome back. Please get a job and become a contributing taxpayer, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Exactly. That is what we want them doing. And so if employers won't even look at their job application, how on earth are they supposed to do that? And so ban the box bans that little checkbox and prevents employers from asking if you have a criminal record until late in the hiring process, basically after they've made an offer. Then they can check your criminal record. But the idea is that by that point, you've already had the chance to convince them that you'd be a great employee, right? And so they won't care as much when they know what your criminal record is as they might have if they just saw the box checked.
Got it. They worked there for a year and a half. They're doing a great job as a social media manager. And they go, by the way, killed a guy in the 70s. I've really, really changed my position. I become a Quaker. And they're like, well, Bob, you're doing a great job. Water under the bridge, Bob.
Exactly. So it's a great idea. Policy is a great idea, right? And
good impulse.
Really caught
it's
on.
Good instinct. Yeah.
Good instinct, right? And I think it is related to a general instinct a lot of us have that if people are using information that we wish they didn't use, or if they want information that we wish they didn't care about, we think we can solve that problem by just taking the information away. This is part of a broader conversation. But so in this particular context, the potential problem is that if employers can't ask if you have a criminal record, nothing about their incentives have changed. For some reason, they cared about that criminal record, but now they can't ask you, is they're going to try to guess who has a criminal record. And who do they guess has a criminal record, especially a recent record they might care about? It's young Black men.
Yeah,
and so they stop
ethnic minorities. Yeah.
So there's now a bunch of research showing, including some by me, showing that basically employers stop hiring young Black men. Presumably, they just stop interviewing those applicants, which means that young Black men who don't have a criminal record are now finding it much more difficult to get a job now that they can't signal that they have a clean record. So there's a bunch of research showing that ban the box has reduced employment for young Black men relative to places without ban the box. Also, really surprisingly, it also didn't increase employment at all for people with criminal records. So at the very least, you sort of expect it to be a little bit of a trade-off. But what seems to have happened is that employers stop interviewing young Black men or dramatically reduce their interviewing of young Black men. And then the few people who get their foot in the door and get that job offer, then they do the background check, and then then they don't hire anyone who had the criminal record anyway. There's still something about that record they really are worried about. And so this leads to other ideas about what we can do about that problem, but ban the box in and of itself appears at this point to be a very ineffective policy.
And then to back up a little bit, if that is the case, I would assume that you would also have seen changes around the 1990s when the internet became more common. Presumably, as employers had easier access to, areyouffelon.com or whatever, that would allay their fears about Black men. So did you see rates of young Black men employment increase when the internet became more ubiquitous?
Beautiful. You are an economist. Yes, there have been econ papers written on this showing that, yes, racial disparities in hiring fell when the box was put onto applications. Exactly.
Okay. All of that makes sense to me. This is this should be page 2 stuff in terms of governance. The government can it can mandate incentives to make you do something, but it can't change what you actually want to do. There's literally no way for the government to say you can't care if they're criminals or not anymore. All you can do is effect the second level of input and output, which is going to have a different effect. On that note, are there any other? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me say a little bit more on that one. So when I have conversations about this with policymakers, I think people hear, okay, ban the box doesn't work, and they think, okay, so you don't want to do anything to help people with criminal records get jobs. And to be clear, I see this as ban the box or something else. It's not ban the box or nothing, or helping people or not. And so I think this issue of, well, what this is making really clear is that employers really care about the criminal record, and simply hiding the information from them is not making them not care, right? Which maybe we shouldn't be surprised about. So finding policies that directly address their concerns, figuring out what their concerns are, and then coming up with policies that directly address their concerns is going to be more effective. And maybe some of them, they just don't like people who've broken the law. You know, they're real sticklers for rules, and no matter what you could tell them about this person, whether they'd be a good employee, they're never going to care, and they're just biased against people who've broken rules before. For them, changing incentives would be difficult. You know, it's going to be a harder problem to solve. My hunch is most employers are worried about stuff like, I don't want to hire someone who's going to steal from me, or I don't want to hire someone who's going to be who's not going to be reliable, who isn't going to show up every day and do a good job. And so they're trying to find people who are going to be a good match for the job and are going to be reliable employees. And so if you can find ways to give them more information about the people who are applying for jobs, then it can give you a way to solve this problem and kind of make everyone happy. And so anyway, so I think the research and policy frontier here is like finding those solutions and trying new things along those lines.
Or I wonder if you couldn't, I like that idea of there being a greater sense of information available. I wonder if you couldn't have some sort of insurance policy available as well. So the state of Texas wants to encourage people to hire people who, again, have done their time and are out on parole or have finished their sentence. They're out on good behavior. And so the state of Texas says, if you hire somebody that has a criminal background, we will guarantee you up to $80,000 worth of damages if they should quit without a 2 weeks notice, or if they should steal from you or something like that. You're not completely on the hook for it. Or you could put it on the front side and just say, we will give you their salary. We'll give you 5% on top of their salary for the first year of employment to incentivize you to do it, or something like that.
Yep. So the U.S. actually does both of these things. They don't seem very effective for some reason, probably because it's a lot of paperwork, it's my guess. But we do have tax credits for employers that hire people with criminal records. My understanding is that employers don't actually file for those tax credits unless they hired lots of people with criminal records. And so it's not really, because it's just so burdensome. The red tape is so burdensome. And so it's just not worth it if you've just got one or two. And so it's unlikely to affect the decisions of an employer who's thinking about hiring someone on the margin, right? So we could think about ways to improve that. There's also the federal bonding program, which has been a program run by the Department of Labor since the 1960s, I believe. And that provides up to $5,000, so not $80,000, but $5,000 of insurance for anyone who is not bondable by commercial insurers. And that includes people with criminal records. And so that program, again, it's been around since the 60s. Nobody knows anything about it. No one's ever heard of it. No one knows. I mean, I think they're just very small numbers of people served by it, which might be a paperwork thing, but might also just be a bad marketing thing. So there are some folks who are now interested in like, all right, are there ways that we could just increase awareness of this program? But there was an experiment recently done on a big employment platform that showed that if you offer employers $1 million of insurance, they are happy to hire people with criminal records. And that changed who they were willing to hire dramatically. And so I mean, I have talked to policymakers who are interested in like, okay, what does a policy based on that look like? Could we have like a local version that's a scaled up version of the federal bonding program for this city, say? And so it is kind of fun to be thinking about what are some ways that we can directly address these employer concerns that just change the incentives here and recognize that what they're worried about is probably the risk in large part. And if we can shift that risk from the employers to the government, then that could help us solve the problem and capture some social benefits here of people working.
So on the flip side, not on things that we're wasting money on, but things that we could be spending money on that would be more effective. Are there alternates to policing or to incarceration that would be cheaper and more effective than the current system?
So my best recommendation here is access to mental health care. So we've got a lot of evidence at this point showing that increasing access to health care in general, but probably coming mostly from access to mental health care, dramatically reduces violent crime and recidivism. And so there is a push in states at this point to allow Medicaid to pay for healthcare people in jails and prisons before they're released, to help improve continuity of care once they're released and out in the communities. They can have, already be connected to a doctor and stuff like that. So I know I am watching that closely. I know a lot of others are really interested in whether that could be a real help. But the expansions of Medicaid through the ACA, which expanded Medicaid to include low-income adults who did not have dependent children, which are going to be generally single men, who are the population at risk here, that dramatically reduced crime and reduced recidivism in the states that expanded Medicaid to that group. So there is kind of growing evidence with lots of, with different types of research designs and different types of policies and programs, all showing that helping connect people with mental health care, giving them access to more affordable health care, all has really big benefits in terms of public safety.
This is great. You're preaching to my inner Norwegian, which wants prison to be primarily rehabilitative and preventative rather than punitive. And part of what they do is vocational training and therapy. And so in this instance, the big broad structure policy would be, I did not know Medicaid previously was not applicable to therapy. You couldn't hire a therapist or a psychiatrist, or maybe a psychiatrist, but not a psychologist.
No, you could. It was just not, most of the population at risk for crime was not eligible for it. So it tended to be, you had to be either extremely low income or you had to have dependent children. And so being low income without kids, which most of these single men are the Medicaid expansion was to add that group.
Okay, well this seems like kind of a really easy fix from my perspective, because that doesn't even, that would mean an increase in resources. You're either going to change the pie of available Medicaid distribution, or you're going to have to increase Medicaid, granted. But if it was good on the preventative end, you'd end up saving money on the back end in terms of money for incarcerating people. So that seems like a good program to be able to enact. It
definitely pays for itself in terms of the social benefits you get. I think the biggest challenge at this point is there are a lot of states that no matter what you tell them about Medicaid are not going to expand Medicaid. And so I think that, Texas, for instance, our home state, has not expanded Medicaid in this way. So I think the question is, can we expand access to healthcare in other ways that do not involve expanding Medicaid? And that's a place I would imagine there would be bipartisan interest. And it's just a tougher policy lever to find.
Is there data available? Like let's say I'm a member of the Texas state legislature, and between you and me, we're not going to get the Medicaid increase. But I am interested in lowering the amount of offenders. So for people that are arrested, they go before the judge, and the judge says, "I'm letting you off with a warning, but you have to do therapy for a year. It has to be twice a month, or something reasonable, that wouldn't preclude you from getting a job or anything. But we're going to build that in some capacity. Now, listen, I can't get it for you in Medicaid, but I can get money out of the Texas throw a brick at 'em penal system code or whatever to fund a greater amount of outpatient prison therapists and things like that. Is there any data that would indicate that just has a reductionist effect on crime?
Yes. Yeah. So there is evidence that increasing access to mental health care, cognitive behavioral therapy, these sorts of things on parole, for instance, is effective as well. So yeah, I think there are a lot of different avenues into this. And even some very low touch and really cheap interventions, like all people who are coming out of jail who screened high or high risk for untreated mental illness, and just make them an appointment at a local clinic. Like that alone, one study found reduced their rearrest and recidivism into going back to that same jail by almost 20%.
Wow. Okay.
And so it's like, that's a really, right? I mean, a lot of this, I think this idea of like a warm handoff, not just making the resources available, but actually making the appointment for them, telling them where to go and when to be there, does a lot of the work. And that's really cheap.
That makes sense to me, because you're leaving prison. You've probably got a lot on your mind. One would assume that your bandwidth is somewhat taxed, and you're worried about the future and where you're going to go. And now you got to figure out how to feed yourself. By the way, you're ineligible for food stamps. and
Right.
all these other things that are going on. You've got a lot on your mind. So having somebody just go, hey, by the way, we've already booked you this. It's not legally required. You don't have to tell them that, but it's not legally required, but it's already
Right.
been there. All you have to do is show up. Don't even worry about it.
Right.
Just next Thursday at 3 p.m., we've got somebody that you could talk to about these issues you're going through and maybe some things involving impulse control you've had problems with in the past. That's very helpful. What
Right.
about like,
Right.
I realize this is kind of sci-fi, but only for the next 2 months or so till it catches up with us. We've got these large language models that now live on our smartphones that are supercomputers that everybody carries around in their pockets. Could you design like a prison therapy app that you could talk to with that, or is that just too reductionist and ridiculous to consider?
Yeah, no, people are definitely considering this. So I would say the main constraint on expanding healthcare access or mental health care access in the US is not just politicians who don't want to do it. It's that we don't have enough mental health professionals.
Okay.
And so even if we wanted overnight, every state was like, great, we're going to expand Medicaid, get everybody a therapist. We could not do that. There are not enough therapists to go around. And so, yeah, people have been looking into like, could we have ChatGPT be your therapist, essentially? I saw one study that suggested that like when people are chatting with a therapist, it works really well until you tell them it's a bot. And then of course, then they're like, they essentially revert and it's like, wait, I thought this person cared about me, right? And it's not, it didn't work. And so I think that we have a lot to figure out there about how to make this, effective, but people are definitely working on this and running some experiments. So we'll see what the impacts are.
What about alternatives to being physically incarcerated? So I recall reading a story, I think in high school. So this is more than 20 years ago, or about 20 years ago, but I remember reading a story that there was some outfit in either Iowa or Idaho or Indiana. It had an I. And there was a big center where people would observe ankle bracelets on people. And if you stepped out of your zone, whether it was your house or your town, I don't know how they said it, the police would come get you, or they would know that you're on the lam or whatever. But the benefit was that at least in the paper I read, again, as a high school student 22 years ago, that it was cheaper to pay this service to just keep track of your ankle bracelet than it was to house you and feed you and pay for security guards at a large prison complex. And then on top of that, you're not getting brutalized, raped, or inducted into gangs or learning how to do other crime type tasks by networking inside a prison. So I kind of thought that was going to be where we were going, was that we would only lock up people that were truly dangerous, and for everybody else, we would just put them under house arrest. Is that a solution? Is there a reason that hadn't happened?
Yeah, so this is something I am very interested in. So other countries do this a lot, like in Europe, Australia, like other countries we like to think of as our peer nations use electronic monitoring as in lieu of incarceration, especially shorter sentences or for early release, something like that, all the time. And it's extremely effective. We now have lots of research showing that using electronic monitoring instead of incarceration dramatically reduces recidivism for the reasons you just described, right? So it reduces the bad peer effects that you might have when you're in prison. You're around a whole bunch of other people who are high risk and aren't the best influence on you. Also, while you're on electronic monitoring, you can go to work. You can help take care of your kids. All of these things that can be very good for you. You can also be, as a condition of being out on electronic monitoring instead of locked up, you can be told you have to go to therapy, for instance, and you're more likely to follow that rule than to engage when you're in prison, because what are they going to do to you when you're in prison, right? You're already there. And so there's a lot of evidence showing really big benefits of putting people on electronic monitoring instead of in prison. It's also a lot cheaper, as you said. So this is something I'm definitely talking to people about now in the US. I think the main reason this hasn't happened in the US is there is a lot of opposition, ironically, from the left for electronic monitoring.
I thought for sure this was going to be cowboy hat opposition.
No.
That this like futuristic European, you already pissed me off, Jen, European. It's from the left?
Yeah, so a lot of people see electronic monitoring as simply an example of net widening. So they are very skeptical that the U.S., given how punitive, we tend to be in the U.S., that we would ever use it in the more enlightened way that these other countries are using it. So even if we pass a law saying we're going to use electronic monitoring as a substitute for incarceration or for early release, somehow it's a slippery slope and everyone will be on electronic monitoring, or everyone who's currently on parole without electronic monitoring will be added. It'll just be an expansion of the carceral state rather than a reduction in it.
Okay.
I am optimistic we can figure out how to do this in the way other countries have done it. And so I'd rather not give up on this quite yet. But because it just seems like both a much more humane way to find like a middle ground between there's some punishment, there's some incapacitation, but you're not fully locked up. It saves us a lot of money.
Yeah.
Good for communities. Like all of these things, we know how to do this well. Surely we can figure it out.
When you're talking to such people, can I give you a suggestion on how you
Please.
might be able to sugarcoat this?
Yes.
In my experience, really lefty people hate when somebody's making a buck off of a public, like there should be no money ever involved. And so they hate private prisons. But my understanding is that private prisons didn't start as a means to make money. They started as a spillover effect from the fact that we had way too many people going into the prison system. So we created this backwater private prison system. So I would go, which would you rather have? Private for-profit prisons, just throwing it out there, or ankle bracelets like in Europe? I feel like my hippie friends, when provided with that option, would go, well, Europe for sure.
I mean, I think adding the like in Europe phrase is probably going to be the key to a lot of these arguments. So I'm definitely going to steal that. But I like we could close a private prison if we used more ankle bracelets.
I code switch on this. When I'm talking to my progressive friends, I bring up Europe as much as I can because they bought a scarf there one time when they went on spring break their junior year, and now they're goddamn French deep down. And when I'm talking to my conservative friends, I'm just like, look, I want the world to be safer, and I want taxpayers to pay less money, and that is why I'm in favor of this. It's saving us money to use ankle bracelets as opposed to using a more expensive government system. I would rather put less money on the preventative end to keep people safe and have tax dollars kept with the taxpayers than pay more to make us less safe. You ever need like a sidekick to come into one of these meetings with you? Like I would be happy to do that.
We'll add you to AV payroll for this. This is great.
If you could create like a sinecure fellowship for me, I feel like I'm at the point in my life where I should be collecting paid sinecure fellowships. Right now I have one unpaid fellowship. I haven't talked to the R Street Institute in 7 years. I think I'm still a fellow, but they're not giving me any money. Just a couple more questions, then I'll let you go because I know we're at an hour now. On the note of private prisons, I've always been fairly neutral towards them. I don't to me, prison is prison, and it's not a huge thing for me. I have friends that believe that they are kind of the source of all evil. From my perspective, this is a situation where we could align incentives better to the public good. So what I would do if I were in charge of a state budget is I would go, hey, private prisons, if you can have a lower recidivism rate than public prisons, we will give you a bonus. So for every prisoner, based on X profile, that national average or state average is they, recommit crime at a rate of, 80% or whatever. If you can break that, if your average is 60%, we'll just give you, a 5% increase or something. It seems to me that there would be incentives that would get them to go, oh, in that case, we'll be Norwegian. Yeah. Hire more therapists and things. Am I right in thinking that, or is that too?
No, you think about it the same way I do. I think I think in general, private prisons, for the reason you mentioned earlier, that folks on the left don't like money to be involved in things, they become a scapegoat in these conversations. And the reason we have high incarceration rates is because of capitalism, when it's actually because we keep voting as a populace. We keep voting for tough on crime policies and for higher incarceration rates and people who vote for them in our legislatures. And so we're the ones to blame for high incarceration rates, not capitalism. And there are incentives in the public prisons too. You've got both the people who work there, public prison unions are very influential, plus food vendors and all these other folks who make money off those prisons. So I do think private prisons are a bit overblown as a root cause of, whatever evil is in the system. But I also agree with you that if we are serious about addressing these problems and aligning the incentives better, it's much easier to rewrite the private prison contracts than to change the incentives in public prisons. And so I think it's actually the way we reimburse hospitals now. I think this was an ACA change also. Hospitals are reimbursed in a way that if someone returns to the hospital, if the patient is released and comes back and is sick again, then somehow their reimbursement is docked. And so they're penalized for that. So we know how to do this. We do this in another system. We could easily come up with the same sort of contract with prisons. If someone is released and comes back, then you're docked in terms of the reimbursement or the payment that you get from the state. And that would switch incentives really fast to figuring out how to improve rehabilitation. This is a choice we've made not to do this. Like this is not a, it's a clever idea, but it is also just a like basic Econ 101 kind of idea.
Because people respond to incentives.
Yeah.
Okay, so final question for you. Are there any other low-hanging fruit that we could enact that would be easy or cheap that would make us safer or spend less money on criminal justice?
Oh man, we've hit on my favorite ones. I think just going back to prisons really quickly, we know we spend so much money on locking people up for a really long time. And frankly, after people are like over the age of 30, they're really not a public safety risk anymore. And so having anyone over the age of even, let's say 40, is just a complete waste of money. And so we could save ourselves a lot of money, put that money toward much better things to improve public safety if we shorten prison sentences. And there are a lot of efforts to...
it was as low as 30, because like I'm 40 now, and frankly, I'm
you still
enjoying
feel like,
my declining testosterone. I like it. I'm less bothered by young men messing with me. Frankly, the amount of sex I'm having versus I want is finally level after 30 years of just incredible, like, it's nice. It's not bad. I don't mind it. And so 40 for me was but kind of that taper. But in terms of crime, like 30 is kind of the bright line there. Like prior to 30,
it's usually like 25 to 30 is like when the age crime trend seems to fall off. Like people age out.
So in terms of in terms of violent crime, just these are problem people that need to be kept away from the population, preventively as a safety measure until they're 30. That makes sense. So if you like rob a liquor store and you got in a bar, you have a history of bar fights and you rob a liquor store and you get arrested, you could look at that guy at the age of 25 and go, look, he needs to be in prison until he's 30 unless something extenuating happens, because this is a really at-risk person and he's been convicted of a crime. But keeping him there from like 30 to 40, we're just doing that for fun at that point. Broadly speaking, people
much
that are incarcerated...
Much less 50 to 60, 60 to 70. Like there's one of the biggest problems in our prison systems now is an expanding elderly population, and they need a lot of healthcare, and so it's even more expensive. But it's just like that's pure retribution, right? There's no public safety benefit to that. Right. On the age piece, so risk assessments are a really big deal in a lot of courts and figuring out who should get bail, and they're used throughout the criminal justice system. And the number one predictor in any risk assessment is age. So if you are a young man, you are high risk of reoffending, and it's difficult for your criminal history to compensate for that. And so, it's just in terms of predicting who is more likely to wind up causing trouble if we were to release them. This comes up a lot because, one way we could be sure purely for public safety, it would be smart in some way to just lock up all the young men. There are reasons we don't do that.
Now that I'm 40, I'm fine with that.
But some people, the young men would have a real problem with it.
And
the is probably not constitutional. Let's just lock up all the young men. But it kind of like puts into perspective, like so much of this is just an age thing, and people do dumb stuff when they're young. And in general, our judges, for good reason, are more lenient toward young people because they recognize that you're less culpable when you are young and stupid. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't, perhaps we shouldn't hold you accountable in the same way. And that goes directly against kind of our focus on risk. And so there's kind of this basic tension in terms of who we're incarcerating. But certainly if we want to focus on if we're interested in the public safety benefit, locking someone up over the age of 35, 40 is really not helpful.
This is a really, really helpful tool to know. Like, again, my ratio of safety to retribution is 80-20, 90-10. So if somebody is arrested at age 27 for getting for assault, I based on my rubric could do something to the effect of, for public safety purposes, they're going to be locked up until they're 30. And because they're a dick, we're going to give them a year to 31, something like that. Like I'm acknowledging that post 30 is just icing to make me feel sated in my vengeance. That's fine. But going like, this 27-year-old is going to be in prison until they're 45. That is a waste of public resources. That is a person that could potentially be a taxpayer, but at the very least not be sucking up resources while they're in prison. And certainly the people that are there into their 60s and 70s become a disproportionate amount of the money we're spending just in terms of their healthcare. So this is very helpful to know.
Right.
All right. Jennifer Doleac, I will let you get back to being Executive Vice President of Criminal Justice at Arnold Ventures. This has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Oh, likewise. Thanks so much, Andrew.
This week's bonus episode is with the writer and media personality Hannah Cox, talking about how YouTube is either precipitating or feeding into a gender war. Hannah and her boyfriend, despite the same politics and worldview, regularly compare notes to see what their respective YouTube feeds suggest that they watch, and the results are sharply deviant and inflammatory. She gets videos about how men are threatened by successful women. He gets videos about how women will all cheat on their guy at the drop of a hat when better jeans are available. They both get lots of videos about how the gender they are not is basically awful. And that algorithmic difference might account for why, according to polls, younger males and younger females are increasingly deviating in their politics compared to how older and other generations work. Previously, political views tended to be more correlated with age, geography, or socioeconomic status. The incoming crop of youth, they are splitting along gender lines, which sounds utterly awful. The amount of trouble I've had with online dating now make it where men and women just disagree with each other on politics right down the line. I can't think of anything worse. If you're under 20, good luck to you come college and shortly thereafter. So that is something that's happening, and it begs the question of why is that happening? Why is politics becoming increasingly genderified? And it's a phenomenon not just limited to here in the States. We're seeing the same polling in Europe and South Korea, and Hannah Cox might have part of the answer to that puzzle. Maybe the answer to that puzzle. Maybe it's clickbait algorithms. Maybe it's something else. That's this week's bonus episode, which you can listen to by going to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Step up, become a patron of the show, and fund this wonderful program. As a thank you, you will gain access to 4 years of bonus content. 4 years of weekly bonus content are waiting for you right now. That's at patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Once again, patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Thanks. That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Jennifer Doleac, for coming on to discuss criminology and economics. Thank you, Eric Stipe, who edited today's program. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.